We're going to pick back up. It's been a couple weeks since we've been in here, and we're in the portion of the study where we look at ourselves and how we present ourselves to the world. And as I've been thinking about how these lessons are lining up, I am interested in how this has come out. I just kind of looked at the problem areas of social media and came up with the topics. But as I look at them, they all have to do with relationships to either God, to ourselves, or to others, which is only natural because we're talking about social media. And social has to do with society, with people bumping into one another, loving each other, hating each other, fighting with each other, encouraging each other. It's all about people and relationships. And so tonight we're continuing thoughts along the lines that we started about a month ago when we talked about identity in the lesson entitled, Who Are You? And then after that, we talked a little bit about, the lesson was entitled Selfies, but it was about our self-obsession online, where we just feel like we got to talk about ourselves so much. And a little of that comes in tonight. But tonight is a little different. We're talking about profiles. The idea is about how you present yourself publicly. Whether you admit it or not, online, if you use social media, and I'm assuming most of you in here do, but this applies even offline, you have a mask that you wear online. You have a public persona. There is a version of you, not the whole you, that's out there for people to see. And it can't be otherwise, right? It's impossible to give the world the entire you, and that could be problematic, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. So this is what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about profiles. And I want to start in Romans 12, verse 3. I've thought about this verse for a long time. On the surface, this looks like a verse that's just about, not being arrogant. And that is what it says, but it says so much more than that too. Paul says, by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So you shouldn't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. Now, that seems pretty plain, but there's so much more under the surface of this verse, because if you look very carefully, you'll notice Paul says there is a way we ought to think about ourselves. And that word ought applies only to human beings. When we talk about creatures that God made, there isn't a way that dogs ought to think about themselves. You can't speak of a duck and say, that duck ought to think more highly of itself than it thinks. I mean, they don't think about themselves. We're the only creatures that think about ourselves, and there is a way that we ought to think about ourselves, and we can go higher than that standard or lower than that standard. You see, if there's a way we ought to think about ourselves, we shouldn't think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. We shouldn't think more lowly of ourselves than we ought to think either. And last time we were together, we were talking about the selfies. We spent a lot of time on this, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. Don't be self-obsessed. Don't promote yourself all of the time. But tonight, we're going to think a little bit about not thinking more lowly of yourself either, and being careful about how you present yourself to the public. Now, this has become a problem for young people in particular, but I think it can apply to anybody. You have archived on your social media accounts a version of your life. And with a lot of teenagers and college students, that might include stuff that kids that age think are funny, that aren't really all that funny as you get older. Or pictures that were a little risque at the time, or things that you forgot about, or just versions of yourself where you're not putting the best foot forward, whatever. And you apply for a job, and guess what the employer does? He's going to scroll through every social media account you've got and check out how you present yourself online. We did that when we were, the last 2 times we searched for youth ministers. I don't know if the elders did, but I did. And there were a couple of guys where, we had meetings and we said, there's some pictures online that make us wonder about this person's maturity or their readiness for ministry or whatever. And that's just natural to do. And it's not just with that. There was a study that was done recently among college admissions and admissions officials, and more than 2/3 of colleges say it's fair game for them to review applicants' social media profiles on sites like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And so they, say it's fair game, which means when they're looking at applicants for the college, they're looking at their social media profiles. Kids are doing this before they go on a date. At least, I'm going to instruct my daughter to do it, and their parents are going to be doing it too. If somebody asks you out, you don't know them very well, what are you going to do? You're going to go check them out online. This is how we do things. When people visit this church, many times at the door, they say, checked you out on your website or looked you up on Facebook before we came. I watched a few of your sermons before I came. I watched a few of the classes before we decided to actually come and visit. And that's just the world we live in. And somebody could say, well, that's not fair. That's not me. That's just a part of me. It's a version of me. It's not the real me. You may not feel like it's fair, but it's a reality of life. And we've got to think about that. We've got to be very, very careful how we present ourselves online. We've already talked about hypocrisy, though. And when we talked about hypocrisy, we were saying, you shouldn't present a false version of yourself. And that's very true, but online, you don't have the option of presenting the whole you. The idea here is to keep something secret that need to stay secret and present only what the world has a right to see about you. And thankfully, there's some great biblical guidelines along these lines that we're going to look at tonight. Here's the first one that we're going to look at. I meant to put that up a minute ago. That was just a little... see, isn't this clever? This guy's got his sunglasses on because he doesn't want people to see the real him. That's what I saw in that picture. I put a lot of time into this class, you see. Here's the first biblical guideline regarding your profile, your public persona. Protect your good name. Now, here's Proverbs 22, verse 1. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. What does the word name mean here in the context of this verse?
Reputation.
Your reputation. So a good reputation is better than great riches. Is that true?
Yes.
That's true. Riches are here today, gone tomorrow. You can't get riches without a good reputation. You can't buy a reputation. You have to work hard for it. And if you lose it, it can really ruin your life. Some people have taken a good name and made it bad. I've always thought the name Jezebel had a nice, beautiful ring to it. Just the sound of the name Jezebel. It has bell at the end. It sounds really beautiful, but nobody would ever name their daughter Jezebel. It probably was a decent name before the queen Jezebel messed it up. But now it's, as bad as Satan or some other word, Hitler or something like that. It's a terrible name because she made it bad. And then you look at others who had a bad name and made it good. The name Caleb, for example, originally meant dog. And in those days, dogs were not as beloved as they are today. Still, you wouldn't want to name anybody a dog, but back then, you called somebody a dog, you were cursing that person. You were saying they were a scourge and they were outcasts and scavengers. And I don't know why Caleb was named dog. I don't know if his mother named him that or he picked that up along the way. But now people are proud to name their boys Caleb because it doesn't mean dog anymore, right? Caleb means hero. Caleb means faith. Caleb refers to somebody who wholly followed the Lord his God and even in his old age said, give me that mountain full of giants. That's what I'm going to conquer. That's who Caleb is. That's what it means now. So you can take a good name and ruin it, or you can take a bad name and you can build it up and make it really mean something It's up to you, but you have to protect that. You have to protect your good name. And it may benefit you, but it's also important if you're a Christian, because you're not just representing yourself and your family, you're representing the church as well. And we should never do anything to soil the name of the church or bring reproach upon the name of the church. All of us have seen these news articles about our brethren, that the world is able to see, where there was some problem or a lawsuit or a disagreement or a crime committed, and we just hang our heads in shame and think, what does the world think about us now? And we have to be careful. Our actions don't just reflect on ourselves, but they reflect upon the Lord's church and the Lord himself. And this isn't anything new. Here's Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles, and that word just means your non-Christian neighbors, honorable. So when, it's not if, but when they speak evil against you, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Day of visitation is probably the second coming. So maybe not here and now, but one day you will be vindicated if you stay honorable. This is the way the early church fought persecution. They did not pick up arms and fight in a flesh and blood conflict. They didn't do it that way. They did use logic and debate. They did more so later on, but they always did so with, Peter said, gentleness and respect. 1 Peter 3:15. But namely, they made sure they kept their noses clean. They followed the laws, as many of them as they could conscientiously follow. They did not go against the law of God. They went out of their way to be kind to one another, to forgive one another, to love and to serve. They were good citizens as well as good Christians. And the world eventually hung their head in shame at the way they've been treating these people. It was a revolution because they kept their conduct honorable. It was a revolution of reputation is what it was. Also look at 1 Peter 4. Peter admitted that, you're going to suffer. He just said, if you suffer, make sure you don't deserve your suffering. If you suffer, make sure you don't deserve it. He says in 1 Peter 4:12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory and God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. Just don't bring shame on the church. Keep your name good. When we're presenting that version of ourselves online, that's a guideline we can follow. Let's make sure we don't ruin our reputation and the reputation of the Lord's church and his people at the same time. Here's another one. Number 2, don't weary the world. Don't wear your friends out. We're getting to one of my favorite proverbs now. Proverbs 25:16 and 17. A lot of people have never looked at this one. This is a very valuable proverb when it comes to human relations. If you found honey, it's also good for dieting and eating. If you found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it, just in time for Thanksgiving, right? We understand that principle. You eat too much sugar, you eat too much candy, you get sick. My son can demonstrate that to you if you would ever need a demonstration. He's got a very sensitive stomach. So if you found honey, sweets, and you get too much of it, you're going to get sick. And look, verse 17, sometimes the Proverbs are just, not related, but verse 17 is connected to verse 16 here. Let your foot be seldom in your neighbor's house, lest he have his fill of you and hate you. So in this analogy, you're the candy, your neighbor's the person having to eat the candy, and too much of you makes him sick. And we say this, don't wear out your welcome. Don't wear out your welcome. Don't weary the world with your public persona. And we've all gotten online, got on Facebook or whatever to look at pictures of family, or just see what's going on, or check into some news, or just to be entertained, and only to find that one of those friends of ours has been engaged in some late night Facebook binging, and just one thing after another, after another, after another, 3 a.m., 3:30, 4 a.m. Your Facebook feed is full of it, and then you get those mundane, everyday announcements like, I'm up. Have you ever seen that? I don't care what time you got up. Coffee. That's another one that gets me. If you want a cup of coffee, get off your computer, go make a cup of coffee. You don't have to say that you need a cup of coffee right now. But that kind of stuff, over and over again, I could not trace it down. Julie and I have laughed about it for a long time. We read a column one time when Facebook was just getting started, and the guy referred to this kind of behavior as the Chinese water torture drip of Facebook status messages. And that's what it is sometimes. Just the mundane, everyday, unnecessary wearing out your welcome online. Don't be that person. Restrain yourself. Read more than you write. That's a good rule to follow as well. And when you're addicted to that kind of self-revelation, you just got to do it over and over and over again. It might indicate, not necessarily, you might just be doing it innocently and you're just excited about sharing things, and that's okay. But it might indicate something that we were talking about 2 weeks ago, self-obsession. So we have to be reminded of some of these passages that we've looked at before that tell us, don't focus on yourself, focus on the other person. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Luke 14:11. Outdo, have a contest. Outdo one another in showing honor. Romans chapter 12, verse 10. Love does not envy or boast. Part of the definition of love, 1 Corinthians 13. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That comes before the marriage roles. That's just a general statement for all Christians. We're to have a submissive attitude towards one another. We ought to be deferential towards one another. At the door, we ought to have a really hard time getting into a building. After you. No, after you. We ought to be that way for one another. In humility, count others more significant than yourselves. How many of us are doing that all the time? Or how many of us are just getting on to see what kind of attention that we can have? We're not here for ourselves. We're here to make other people's lives better. When you're focusing on yourself, and I know we discussed this 2 weeks ago, how do you feel when you're just focused on yourself? Awful, right? You just feel terrible. I think you were saying this, Mackenzie. You just feel terrible. And when you focus on the other person, it automatically makes you feel better. It's just a rule of life, whether you're online or offline. So remember that. The best way to get control of this overabundance of wearing out your welcome is just focus on the other person. So that's the second thing. Don't weary the world. And here's the third one. And I want to spend the rest of our time really on this idea and some development of it. Keep some secrets. Let there be a mystery about you. Keep some things to yourself. Not everything needs to be told. Here's something from the Roman poet Ovid. He lives well who hides well. He lives well who hides well. We talk a lot about revealing secrets in church, right? We say you should confess your sins to one another so that you can pray for one another. Don't be a hypocrite. Be yourself. Be true in your presentation of yourself. We don't talk enough about keeping secrets. It's a biblical concept as well. depending on the context. For one thing, if you've got somebody else's secret, you need to keep that quiet. There's a real temptation to share other people's secrets because people love to hear that. You could be the most popular guy in the room if you got some juicy information about another person. That's what Proverbs 26:22 says. The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels that go down into the inner parts of the body. Gossip is tastier than turkey and dressing on Thanksgiving. And just people love to hear it. But let's look at a few passages on gossip. We've got time. I want y'all to read these for me. Somebody read Proverbs 11:13, Proverbs 20:19, and Proverbs 25, verse 9. So the first one is Proverbs chapter 11, verse 13. Whoever gets there, just go ahead and start reading.
Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered.
So the person revealing secrets is doing what? He goes about slandering. And the wise person is the one that keeps his mouth shut. Proverbs 20, verse 19.
Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with a simple babbler.
Do not associate with these people. Because it's really, isn't it hard when a gossip is just blurting it all out? A man I really admire one time, he's an elder of the church. I saw him, it had to get really awkward for him to stop it. And he just said, he broke in, he said, "Stop it right now, I will not listen to this." But it's probably best if you know the person's nature just to stay away from them, not get involved in a conversation like that. Because it's hard not to hear it when it's coming at you so fast. And then how about Proverbs 25, verse 9?
Argue your case with your neighbor himself, and do not reveal another's secret.
Do not reveal another's secret. So are there secrets we should keep? Yes. Number one, we should keep other people's secrets. When somebody shares a secret with you, what are they saying in that exercise of sharing a secret with you? They're saying they trust you, and they're honoring you in doing that. And when you gossip, you ruin that. So you show trust by honoring another person's secrets, which makes it so strange that we share so much of our own secrets with the world voluntarily on social media. We say things on social media about ourselves. We reveal things that we would never reveal in face-to-face conversations. It's strange behavior, but it's what we do. And when we do that, we give up our dignity, because when you do that kind of thing, when you're quick to share things with people that don't have a right to hear it, you're giving up a part of you, and the result is shame. Here's a quote I found very interesting from Wendy Shallot in her book on modesty. She said, "Our dignity is in our secrets. If nothing is secret, nothing is sacred." Isn't that true? Your dignity is bound up in your secrets. And we'll unravel that a little bit in a moment, but I want to illustrate this with an example that everybody knows about, Samson. And I don't know if you ever thought about the story of Samson this way. Samson had a really hard time. That's an appropriate picture, right? You can look online for pictures of Samson. It's a little sketchy. So I just put that up and I thought, okay, it could be better, but that's what it is. How about this? I'll just go back to that. I'm talking about not putting everything online. Here we got this going online, and I got a picture of Samson. Samson is a story, maybe you haven't thought about how bad Samson was at keeping secrets. He was terrible at it. Two examples from his life. One, he's on his way to his wedding, and he kills a lion in secret. He took this Nazirite vow not to touch a corpse. I may have gotten the timeline wrong on this, but on the way to the wedding, he saw the lion that he killed, the corpse of the lion that he killed, and there was honey in it. And he took the honey and he ate some of it, violating the Nazirite vow. he goes to the wedding and feast, and these are long, drawn-out, week-long feasts, and they don't have TV or anything, so they tell riddles. And in that culture, you gained honor by telling the best riddle. If you could stump people with the riddle, then you were considered really smart. Well, Samson told a riddle that really wasn't fair. It was like the riddles the boys around here tell. They just have no... It's a riddle, they say, but there's no clue in the riddle about the answer. And then, of course, you can't answer it, and they laugh and they say, you didn't get it. It's a bad riddle. Well, Solomon kind of did a bad riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And they made this deal. If they could answer it, he had to give them 30 changes of clothes. If he answered it, they had to give him 30 changes of clothes. Well, they couldn't answer it, but they went to his bride and they kept pestering her to get the answer from Samson, which she was able to do. She told her life was in danger, her father's life. They said, if you don't tell us, we're going to burn your father to death. So she, under pressure, got the answer, told it to them. They humiliated Samson on the 7th day of the feast. He goes out and kills 30 people to get the clothes, and then goes to his father's house in hot anger, and his bride goes to his best man. Where did that get him? He revealed a secret, and it ended in total humiliation. See what I'm saying about the dignity? He let go of a secret, and his dignity was gone. The most famous part of that is the second example, which is Delilah. Another bad woman for Samson. He falls in love with this Philistine woman, Delilah. She wants to know the secret of his strength. And he leads her on several times, and you know how the story goes. And finally, for some unknown reason, I guess she bothered him so much, he told her the secret to his strength. You cut my hair, and I will lose my strength. He fell asleep. She cut his hair. He was bound. His eyes were gouged out. He began grinding mill for the amusement of the Philistines. Humiliation. And so it's true that our dignity is wrapped up in the secrets that we keep. Now, I want to talk about a concept here called intimacy. The basic idea of intimacy is to be known and loved. And this is the heart of the nature of secrets. And this will help you determine who to share your secrets with and who to keep them from. The degree to which you have intimacy determines privacy. I don't know if that makes sense, but the closer you are to a person, the more that person has a right to your secrets. Now, the first at the top of the list is God, because he already knows everything about you. Anyway, Jeremiah 23:24, can a man hide himself in secret places so that cannot see him? Do not fill heaven and earth? All things are open and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. That's Hebrews 4:13. You'll notice that the further away you get from God, the less intimacy from God, the more we try to hide from him. But we can't hide from God. And so at the top of the list, God knows everything already, so we can tell him. We're encouraged to confess our sins to him and to be open to him and be honest to him. But we still, if we're doing that, we still have this compulsion to tell people about ourselves. And the reason for that is we need to do that, but we don't need to do it online on social media, because we're doing that to strangers, which leads to humiliation. We've got to do it. There's got to be a safe place for us to do that. And yes, that should be in your family, and yes, that should be with your close friends. But the Lord established the church as a place for that to happen as well. In the early church, Acts 2 tells us they had all things in common. I have to run through this quickly, but 1 Corinthians 5 tells us that they held one another accountable. James 5:16 tells us they confessed their sins to one another so that they could pray for one another and be healed. They were very open with one another, and churches were regarded as places where you came to be encouraged, or maybe held accountable, or maybe confronted, or maybe comforted. But they were places where brothers and sisters in a family of intimacy knew one another and surprisingly still loved one another. I should have said that a moment ago. It's amazing that God knows us and still loves us. And church is a place where we copy that behavior, where we know each other, warts and all, and at the end of the day, we don't hate each other. We actually love each other despite all of that, because there's forgiveness and forbearance. Church ought to be the place where we can safely reveal those secrets and don't feel like we've got to go to somebody we hardly know who might humiliate us online or offline. Now, there's still people who are wanting to know your secrets, still stalking you online. Have you ever used that phrase? One of my favorite movies is Rear Window, Hitchcock movie with James Stewart, the greatest actor who ever lived, James Stewart. Jimmy Stewart plays this really creepy guy in this movie. He's a photographer who broke his leg, and so in his free time, in convalescence, he's staring out his rear window in Greenwich Village at all of his neighbors, and he's even using his zoom lens, and most of them are just doing everyday mundane things, practicing the piano, having conversations, talking on the telephone, writing letters, just making dinner and doing things like that. But then he thinks he sees a murder. What does he do? He calls the police. They're kind of want to know how he learned this information. Does he tell them, well, I've been staring out my window at everybody, been using my zoom lens to get a good look at everybody, I just happened to see it. He's kind of in a bind here, so he tries to take care of it himself. And it's a very suspenseful thing, as all the Hitchcock movies are. But when you're online, sometimes you feel like there are these Jimmy Stewarts looking out their rear windows at you and spying on you and wanting to learn your personal information. And social media is designed to try to encourage you to give up all that information. So what do? Do we just unplug and hate it and walk away from it? I think the best thing that we can do when confronted by this voyeurism, or whatever you want to call it, is to realize that people are just wanting to be loved. That's what that impulse is. When you're trying to learn about somebody, get their personal information, you're wanting to love them. You're wanting somebody to trust you with their secrets. And that's an opportunity. We need to see these people as lonely and lost and in need of a friend. And realize that a lot of the world out there is like that. And so we can give them, through Christ, this place of intimacy where you can both be known and still loved in the church as we imitate that knowledge and loving that we see in God the Father.